On January the 16th and 17th, 1943, after a 14-month intermission, the Royal Air Force launched its heaviest bombardments to date on the Reich's capital city, Berlin. 88 people were killed in the bombardments, but only 23 of the 265 attacking British planes were shot down. Hitler's winning streak was over. In North Africa, the German army was retreating. In Russia, the Sixth Army was surrounded at Stalingrad, and the Luftwaffe had lost air supremacy over Germany. With this air raid, the theater of war had finally reached Berlin. Just one day after the attacks, Joseph Goebbels declared total war in a speech at the Sportpalast. Although Hitler had rarely been in Berlin since the start of the war, he was now worried about his safety within the Reichschancellery. On January the 18th, just one day after the air raids and on the day of Goebbels' declaration of total war, Hitler commissioned Albert Speer with the enlargement of the Reichschancellery bunker in Berlin and with the reinforcement of the bunkers of the new Reichschancellery. Speer was, however, not the architect in this case. The extension of the existing bunker had already been planned in 1942, so Albert Speer, as head of the Todt organization in charge of all major building projects, was only required in January 1943 to present the plans that had previously been drawn up by his head of office, Piepenburg. The extension of the Reichschancellery bunker involved two separate building works. The first was the reinforcement of the existing bunker. The second was the construction of a new, deeper bunker, the so-called Tiefbunker. It was to be linked by a staircase to the existing Reichschancellery bunker. During a bombing attack, Hitler would have had to pass through the old Reichschancellery bunker on his way from his apartment into the new Tiefbunker. He therefore ordered the old bunker to be reinforced. Through the enlargement of the shelter, the old bunker of the Reichschancellery would become the Tiefbunker's vestibule and would therefore be called the Vorbunker. While the Vorbunker would continue to be used by the occupants of the old Reichschancellery, the Tiefbunker would be reserved for Adolf Hitler alone. He ordered the Tiefbunker to be laid out on a similar scale as the Vorbunker. But the floor of the new bunker should be 7 meters below the Earth's surface, that is 2 meters deeper than the base of the Vorbunker. This enabled the ceiling of the Tiefbunker to be as much as 4 meters thick. The Tiefbunker would be built in the garden of the Reichschancellery, directly in front of the reception hall. A road leading from Hermann Göring Street through the garden of the Foreign Office would be used as a secondary access road to the construction site. For this, a breach in the new pergola near the reception hall was planned. One further access into the garden of the Reichschancellery already existed. The northwestern corner of the pergola had not been closed since the official opening of the new Reichschancellery. During 1943, Hitler either stayed at his headquarters in eastern Prussia, which was known as the Wolf's Lair, or at the Berghof in Bavaria. As he only spent a few days in Berlin, it was not necessary to take him into consideration during the construction works. The once so well-maintained garden of the Reichschancellery was transformed into a huge building site. So as to protect at least Hitler's study from the attention of curious construction workers, a wooden screen was erected along the entire length of the Reichschancellery garden. The screen ran diagonally across the garden, parallel to the side access road, which had been made for the use of construction vehicles. In the summer of 1943, workers from the Hochtief Company began preparations for the construction of the Tiefbunker. To gain a secondary access to the building site and allow enough space for the machinery, the roof and some of the columns were removed from the east side of the pergola, and an opening was made in its back wall. Before the construction work could start, the stone paving slabs also had to be removed from the terrace. Since the water table in Berlin lay at a depth of 3 meters and the base of the construction pit was to be at 10 meters, it was necessary to lower water levels in the region of the building site. Several well shafts were drilled close to the building site, from which water could be pumped via a system of pipes into the city's drains. From now on, the pumps worked day and night to keep the building site and later the bunker itself dry. To remove groundwater from the area of the bunker, a special pipe was laid at an angle through the garden of the Reichschancellery, ending in the drain at Hermann Göring Street. After these initial preparational measures had been completed, the first 4 meters of the excavation pit could be dug out. In the next phase of work, a curtain of steel pilings were rammed deep into the ground. This ensured that the later 10-meter-high side walls of the excavation pit would not collapse in the course of building operations. As with the Vorbunker before, the Tiefbunker was built in an open excavation pit. This method of bunker construction was unusual during the war, as Allied planes entered German airspace on a daily basis. They would have been able to observe the building activities and to take photographs. There must have been great confidence in the strength of the bunker, as the site would have been known to the enemy even before construction began. Concentrated attacks on the bunker were to be expected. Once the steel pilings were rammed into the ground, the pit could be excavated to its final depth. The pit was an estimated 10 meters deep and 40 by 40 meters wide. The pit provided enough space for the Tiefbunker itself, the guard rooms, an airlock, and an integrated stairwell. The Tiefbunker was erected up to 3 meters away from the reception hall to prevent it from sliding into the construction pit and to ensure its stability. In this way, the Vorbunker could remain fully operational at all times during the construction of the Tiefbunker. The Tiefbunker and its entrances dictated the size of the base plate, which was cast at a thickness of approximately 2.5 meters into the base of the excavation pit. This provided the foundation on which the entire superstructure was to be erected. The foundation of the bunker measured 28 meters in the north-south direction and approximately 30 meters in the east-west direction. The external walls of the Tiefbunker were made of 3.5 to 4 meters thick reinforced concrete, according to Hitler's exact specifications. To make the walls, a mesh of steel bars was first erected and then shuttered using wooden boards in the conventional way. Concrete would then be poured into the resulting form at a later stage. Special openings for doors or supply shafts had to be worked into this wooden construction before the form could be filled with concrete. There are indications that such a shaft was integrated into the wall at the eastern side of the machine room. It probably allowed ventilation pipes from the air raid ventilation system to pass through into the bunker. When the wooden shuttering was complete, the pouring of the outer walls could begin. The liquid concrete was poured into the steel network covered by the wooden panels. This combination of steel and concrete gave the resulting reinforced concrete its special strength. The internal space of the Tiefbunker measured 20 meters from north to south and 15.6 meters from east to west. It seems that Hitler was satisfied with the layout of the Vorbunker, as he wanted the Tiefbunker to be almost one-to-one replica of it. The inner walls of the Tiefbunker all collapsed in 1947 during an attempt to demolish the Führerbunker. For this reason, there were no details of the Tiefbunker's internal layout in the survey carried out by the East German Secret Service in 1973. The rooms in the bunker used by Hitler himself were, however, photographed between 1945 and 1947, allowing us to make a fair reconstruction of the southwestern area of the Tiefbunker. But exact measurements are only known for Hitler's office, which was 3.37 by 3.17 meters. The size and the functions of the other rooms can be approximated through eyewitness reports. The dividing walls, which created the different rooms, were cast with a thickness of 50 centimeters. These walls were cast within the bunker shell once the outer walls were completed. They were only connected to the outer walls by means of 3 or 4 steel bars bent out from the steel matrix of the outer walls before the concrete was poured in. The inner walls, therefore, stood as a kind of free-standing grid, more or less independent from the outer walls of the bunker. In this way, it was ensured that, should the outer walls shift under a direct hit, they would not take the inner walls with them. The inner walls were essential to prevent the ceiling of steel girders from collapsing, which will be described later. Although the interior fittings were installed sometime after the completion of the framework of the Tiefbunker, it makes sense to describe the use of the rooms at this point. As in the Vorbunker, the room in the Tiefbunker for the emergency generator and the air filters for the ventilation system was located at the northwestern corner of the bunker. Opposite this room was the washroom with the toilets. Adjoining the washroom was a room containing electrics and pumps for wastewater extraction and for the internal freshwater well. The layout of the Tiefbunker was almost an exact copy of the Vorbunker. However, comparing the arrangement of the doors between the two bunkers, it becomes clear that the Tiefbunker was not just a simple copy, but had been especially designed for Hitler's use. The Vorbunker was designed to shelter up to 250 people. The doorways were arranged to allow people looking for shelter to disperse quickly into all the rooms. 8 of the rooms did not even have doors, but pillars on each side to support the ceiling. In this way, 4 double rooms were created, which were well suited to sheltering a large number of people. 4 doors led from the passages into the northern and the southern rooms of the Vorbunker. This bunker did not contain any private chambers. A comparison of the doorways of the Vorbunker and the Tiefbunker quickly reveals how different the two bunkers were, in spite of their almost identical spatial arrangements. The Tiefbunker, like the Vorbunker, had its entrance from the eastern side and was reached through a long vestibule. But from here, only 2 doors led to the live-in areas of the bunker. Through these doors, access could be gained to the southern and northern parts of the bunker. These were 2 quite separate entities. The northern part of the Tiefbunker contained rooms reserved for Hitler's adjutants. This northern part of the bunker was only accessible through the door in the vestibule. The area reserved for Hitler's own use was located in the southern part of the bunker. This part consisted of a waiting room, a meeting room, and 5 private rooms. Hitler's private chambers had a direct access to the Chancellery garden via the waiting room and the garden exit. The private rooms could only be entered through the door from the waiting room. They consisted of a foyer, from which doors opened into his dressing room and into his study. Hitler's bathroom could be entered from both of these 2 rooms. From the study led a further door through to Hitler's bedroom. In a close comparison of the Vorbunker and the Tiefbunker, it becomes evident that the Tiefbunker was not, as often claimed, a simple extension of the existing Vorbunker. The Vorbunker was designed in 1935 as an air raid shelter for the Reichschancellery. 2 entrances and a great number of sometimes over-dimensional doorways enabled the rapid dispersion of a large number of people. The Tiefbunker, on the other hand, had only 1 entrance. This entrance led to a room from which 2 doors led to the 2 live-in areas of the bunkers. The 5 living rooms, which were not part of Hitler's private area, could only be entered through 1 door in the vestibule. Hitler's own area, which occupied a little over a third of the Tiefbunker, could also only be entered through 1 door. That sufficed, as this area of the bunker was reserved for him with just the occasional function in the meeting room. When the plans for the construction of the Tiefbunker were submitted to Hitler, he accepted them with 1 alteration. He ordered the ceiling of the bunker to be reinforced with steel girders as a final layer of protection. This technique was known to him from the fortresses at the east and the west wall. If the ceiling were to be damaged, the girders would prevent sections of concrete from caving in. Hitler only requested the girders, however, in his final approval of the construction plans. As the building preparations were already at an advanced stage, the installment of the girders meant a reduction in headroom. The planned height of the rooms was probably 3.08 meters, as in the Vorbunker. With a deduction of 3 centimeters for the floor tiles and about 20 centimeters for the steel girders, the height of the rooms would now only be 2.85 meters. The exact arrangement of the steel girders can no longer be ascertained. However, it is certain that each of the girders, resting on outer and inner walls, spanned 1 or 2 rooms. The beams themselves were in the shape of a double T steel girder. Their height was 20 centimeters and their width was 24 centimeters. Each girder was laid out at a distance of 4 centimeters to the next one. Steel plates, approximately 16 centimeters wide and 0.5 centimeters thick, were inserted into the empty spaces between one girder and the next. In this way, a closed steel girder ceiling was created for the rooms, which extended a further 25 centimeters into the outer walls. The combination of steel beams and steel plates created an extra strong roof construction. The key to its robustness lay in its flexibility. The steel sheets, which were inserted between the beams, only possessed a thickness of 0.5 centimeters, which meant that they could relatively easily be deformed. If a strong point force was applied, these steel plates would distort, and much of the energy of the explosion could be dispersed. The steel girders themselves could also deform. The beams at the center of impact were forced apart, thus diffusing much of the force of impact before it reached the inner part of the bunker. However, to limit the extent of this deformation, the beams were placed in batches, aligned at 90 degrees to one another. If hit, the batch of girders sharing the same alignment would distort together. The deformation of one batch of girders would be limited by the surrounding batches lying at 90 degrees to it. Due to a lack of documentation, a reconstruction of the area around the garden exit becomes extremely difficult. The measurements of the Stasi prove that there was an exit through the western external wall of the bunker. This led to a guard room, which was 3 meters 30 wide and 3 meters 80 long. This room was connected through 1 meter thick walls with one room to the north and one room to the south, each measuring 2.2 meters wide. The lengths of these two rooms are not known, but their appearance and function were described in eyewitness accounts documented after the war. According to these reports, the northern room was used as an airlock. This room was also connected to a staircase with a width of 2.15 meters and a length of approximately 4 meters. The room south of the guards room led to an emergency exit. This is probably also where the air inlet of the main ventilation system ended, through which fresh air was supplied to the bunker under normal conditions. Both the 3.5 meter thick reinforced ceiling of the Tiefbunker and the outer walls were made out of so-called heavy concrete. This concrete contained an especially high percentage of stone aggregate material. The ceiling of the bunker was also reinforced with steel. The function of the reinforcement should be briefly described at this point. If a bomb scored a direct hit on the bunker roof, the force of the impact and the explosion on the upper side of the roof would have caused a so-called blast funnel. The shock of the detonation would have dispersed from the point of impact in the form of a half-sphere. If the ceiling had been made out of pure concrete, the shock waves would have blasted off some of the material on the underside of the ceiling. A so-called detonation lens would have resulted, and the occupants of the bunker would have been more likely to have been injured or killed by falling concrete fragments. In order to avoid this, standard practice in bunker construction was to add steel reinforcement rods to the concrete. For the construction of the Tiefbunker, a so-called cubic reinforcement was employed. Here, the steel rods, each with a diameter of 10 to 12 millimeters, were evenly ranged in all three axes at an interval of 10 to 15 centimeters. Concrete was then poured into the resulting matrix. If the roof had been hit by a bomb, it would still have caused an explosion funnel on the upper side of the ceiling, but the effects of the explosion would have been drastically reduced. The force of impact and of the explosion would have been channeled into the distortion of the steel bars. A swelling would have resulted on the underside of the ceiling, but the steel reinforcement would have prevented the concrete from falling down. Because the Tiefbunker had an additional ceiling made of flexible steel girders, no concrete fragments could be loosened by the blast into the rooms below. Since two supply shafts needed to pass through the ceiling of the southeastern room of the Tiefbunker and up to the surface, here two special forms had also to be prepared before the concrete could be poured in. It is known that the shafts were lined with metal plates. It may also be presumed that the metal plates on the walls of the shafts were put in place before the concrete was cast. The position of the entrance to the southern shaft was, according to documentation, 1.5 meters lower than the top of the bunker roof. The position of the entrance to the eastern shaft is yet unknown. The purpose of the shafts is also unclear. It could be that the eastern shaft contained the electricity supply. The size and the position of the southern shaft allow us to conclude that it was used to transport wastewater to the surface. The exit shaft for the air raid ventilation system was at the northeastern corner of the bunker, running vertically through the bunker ceiling. The passage for the garden exit was also created on the western side of the bunker. The walls of this opening consisted of a rectangular shaft extending through the ceiling of the western outer bunker wall down to the floor of the bunker. Above the entry room to the emergency exit, a rectangular shaft was also created in which iron steps were fixed. This emergency exit led to the filter room under the garden and was intended to give the bunker's inhabitants another way to escape to the surface in case the two main entrances were blocked by debris. In order to achieve optimal strength from the concrete, the ceiling, like the outer walls before it, had to be cast in one piece. This required an enormous amount of organization. Liquid concrete had to be continually available until the forms had been filled. The combination of the tight steel network and the heavy concrete proved to be a huge technical challenge. With its high stone aggregate content, it was difficult to pour the concrete through the 3.5-meter high network without leaving any hollow spaces. The concrete needed more water than would normally be used to make it flow through the mesh evenly. This high water content, however, meant that the concrete took longer than normal to set. The shell was complete once the ceiling of the bunker had been cast. A section through the western supply zone of the Tiefbunker shows the arrangement of the stairs. 37 steps led from the Tiefbunker into the garden of the Reichschancellery. The steps were 1 meter wide and 19 centimeters high. One flight consisted of 9 steps. The staircase had 4 turns, and the size of the 2 flights was identical. The final task was to clad the 2 outside sloping walls on the east of the building with red bricks. This diffusion layer offered additional protection from direct lateral hits. The outer walls were then coated with tar to protect the bunker against moisture. The overground part of the Tiefbunker could now be finished. To begin with, only the space between the bunker's roof and the ground level in the area of the garden exit was filled with a 50-centimeter layer of soil. The rest of the bunker ceiling was also to be covered with soil once the concrete had hardened. The exit area in the garden was created on top of the deposited soil. The staircase was to end in a concrete block, which, with its 3-meter thick walls, would provide maximum protection for the exit. In contrast to the construction of the bunker, no concrete foundation was made for the protective tower of the garden exit. The exit tower constituted an independent part of the bunker, which was neither connected to the staircase shaft nor to the bunker itself. A separate steel mesh was therefore constructed for it. Here, however, the steel mesh stood on the soil, unconnected to the bunker or to the staircase. Therefore, the layer of earth between the garden exit and the bunker ceiling served as a buffer between the Tiefbunker and the garden exit tower. If the garden tower were to be impacted by a bomb, the shock wave would be dispersed by the soil and the force of impact on the Tiefbunker itself would be considerably reduced. Yet another wooden form was erected to allow concrete to be poured into the steel mesh construction for the protective tower of the garden exit. In contrast to the walls of the bunker, the walls and the ceiling of the garden exit tower were individually cast in several separate layers. The effort to cast it in one piece would have been disproportionate to their minor function of this part of the bunker. The garden exit tower was given a layer of steel girders to lend additional strength to the ceiling. An especially large girder was installed over the inner door. This would offer additional protection for the door frame, as well as providing a support base for other girders. These were laid in east-west direction on the outer walls of the exit tower of the garden exit. The tower of the garden exit was then given a 3-meter thick concrete roof. There is no reliable information about the appearance and the workings of the ventilation inlet and outlet shafts ending above the level of the bunker roof. Since these shafts were built over at the beginning of 1945, eyewitness reports are the only reliable source of information for the reconstruction. The eyewitnesses relate that after the completion of the bunker, the air shafts ended at the level of the bunker ceiling. A metal grill then secured the opening of each shaft. The air inlet for the main ventilation system was to be found above the southwestern corner of the Tiefbunker. The shaft for the emergency exit ended here in a room also containing the air filters. The northern part of the room was most likely to have been secured with a concrete ceiling in order to protect the shaft from penetrating bombs. In the southern part of the ceiling of the filter room could be found the opening with a metal grill. In the Tiefbunker, a combined ventilation system built by Drägerwerk Lübeck was installed, in which the main ventilation worked on a flow principle. The outflowing air passed through the staircase to the surface. It is most likely that the outflowing air was expelled through the shaft located underneath the exit room. The ventilation outlet was situated next to the stairwell in a small shaft, 50 centimeters wide, 1 meter long, and 50 centimeters high. In the northeastern area of the Tiefbunker, at garden level, there were also ventilation shafts. The shaft described earlier, ending right in front of the reception hall, was the air outlet for the air raid ventilation system. The air inlet for the air raid ventilation system was close to the pergola wall, north of the Tiefbunker. The bunker would be supplied with fresh air via this shaft during an air raid alarm. In contrast to the main ventilation system, the filters for the air raid ventilation system were located in the engine room of the bunker. It was therefore possible to change them from inside the bunker even during a prolonged gas attack. The shell of the Tiefbunker had been completed by autumn 1943. However, as the Tiefbunker was to be connected with the Vorbunker, which was to become part of the greater bunker complex, the Vorbunker had to be reinforced. In 1943, new high-caliber bombs could have penetrated the 1.6-meter ceiling of the Vorbunker. The reinforcement of its ceiling was therefore the most important safety measure for the Vorbunker. Under the dance floor of the reception hall was a 50 centimeter thick air cushion. Part of this air cushion was now to be sacrificed for the strengthening of the bunker ceiling. In this way, the reinforcement of the Vorbunker could be carried out without having to sacrifice the reception hall. The air cushion above the bunker ceiling, in the zone between the bunker and the winter garden, was filled with a double layer of iron girders and a layer of unreinforced concrete. Studies have until now failed to explain how this was carried out. The eastern row of columns in the reception hall stood on the roof of the bunker directly above the internal division walls. The simplest method would have been to let the columns remain where they were and to fill the air cushion around them with concrete. However, an examination of the photographs of the bunker ceiling taken after the end of the war does not reveal any indication of remains of the column bases. Therefore, it must be assumed that the eastern columns were not still standing on the bunker roof while the roof was being reinforced. The construction of the reception hall would have permitted the removal of the columns, as its outer walls could have easily taken the weight of the roof. The reinforcement of the bunker ceiling was therefore probably carried out as follows. First of all, the columns which were impeding the construction work were taken apart and removed from the building site. The dance floor was then removed, in addition to the 50-centimeter high column bases, which extended through the air cushion to the ceiling of the bunker. In the next step, 2 layers of double T girders were laid directly on top of the bunker ceiling. In contrast to the Tiefbunker's ceiling, the girders of the Vorbunker were laid down without any spaces between them. Unlike in the Tiefbunker, there were no iron plates between the girders. The spaces between the girders were filled with fine concrete until a smooth surface had been created. After the concrete hardened, the remaining 20 centimeters were filled with unreinforced concrete. After the concrete had hardened, the columns were returned to their original locations. Now they were standing without their bases directly on the ceiling of the Vorbunker. After completing this work, a new 60-centimeter strong protecting layer of steel beams and concrete was laid on the ceiling of the Vorbunker. By this addition, with an overall strength of 2 meters 20, there was a greatly improved protection against bombs. The reinforcements of the Vorbunker were now complete. The concrete of the Tiefbunker would still take several months to harden completely. As the Vorbunker had received a double layer of steel beams, it was until 1944 the safer of the 2 bunkers. But in order to make use of the Tiefbunker, it still had to be connected to the Vorbunker. To connect the Tiefbunker and the Vorbunker with each other, the western basement corridor of the reception hall, located adjacent to the Vorbunker, had to be integrated into the bunker's staircase. However, the whole western facade of the reception hall rested on a wall-like foundation through which the new opening to the new underground corridor had to be inserted. If the reception hall was to remain intact, this section of the facade had to be artificially supported during the excavation of the passage. First, a breach was made in the western outer wall of the reception room. Concrete-coated steel beams were laid over the gap to support the wall of the reception room above. The staircase was not nearly as strongly constructed as the Tiefbunker itself. There are indications that the outer walls of the staircase were constructed out of pure heavy concrete. It seems that for this minor area of the bunker, an extra reinforcement of the concrete was not considered necessary. The concrete walls of the staircase were also only 2 meters thick. 2 flights of stairs bridged the 2 meters difference in height between the Vorbunker and the Tiefbunker. After leaving the Vorbunker, the stairs turned 90 degrees to the north. Five steps, each with a height of 17 centimeters and a depth of 28 centimeters, led down to an interim level. Here, the stairs turned again through 90 degrees and then led, after 7 more steps, in a westerly direction to the guards' room in the Tiefbunker. A layer of steel girders reinforced the ceiling of the staircase. These girders each had a width of 21 centimeters. The arrangement here was identical to the one previously described in the Tiefbunker. After the ceiling of the staircase was completed, the entrances to the western basement passage of the reception hall were bricked up. The remaining spaces were filled with concrete. This stabilized the western outer wall and provided an additional protection for the Vorbunker. As a last security measure, the space between the Tiefbunker and the external wall of the reception hall was filled with concrete. If a bomb had hit the space between the Vorbunker and the Tiefbunker, the pressure wave of the explosion would have accumulated between the walls and would have had a much greater destructive force than if it had just exploded on top of the bunker ceiling. With the finishing up of the concrete works for the connecting staircase between the Vorbunker and the Tiefbunker, the shell of Hitler's new chancellery bunker was complete. To facilitate a swift hardening of the concrete of the Tiefbunker, the bunker ceiling was not immediately covered by soil. Since in 1943 Hitler only came to Berlin twice for a few days, it was thought that there would be enough time to wait until the still damp bunker walls dried out before starting on the interiors. After finishing the shell of the Tiefbunker, the construction team could start the implementation of the second part of the building plans, which had been ordered by Hitler in January, the reinforcement of the bunkers of the new Reichschancellery. But nobody at the time could have predicted how much more significant these construction works would become after the events of July 20th, 1944.